everybody. My name is Jim Hemphill. I write about movies for IndieWire and American Cinematographer, and I'm your host for today's half hour with The Power of the Dog. With us today, we have cinematographer Ari Wegner, editor Peter Sciberras, and production designer Grant Major. Welcome, everybody.
Hello. Hello there.
So before we get started and delve into Power of the Dog, let's take a look at the trailer for people who haven't seen the movie so they can get a little bit of context for what we're talking about here.
25 years since our first run together. 1900 and nothing.
It's a long time.
What you doing? Getting mixed up with her.
You are marvelous, Rose. We were married Sunday.
I wonder what little lady made these.
I did, sir.
Well, Brother Phil?
Open up the gate, let him out.
You sure he's not ready?
Go on, let him out.
He's just a man, Peter. Only another man.
A man's made by patience and the odds against him.
For what kind of man would I be if I did not help my mother?
Peter!
If I did not save her?
Sort of a lonesome place out here, Pete. Unless you get in the swing of things.
So one of the things I love about this movie is it just has such a unique and distinctive tone. I mean, it's part Western, part psychological thriller, part character study. It's just doing so many different things at once in such unexpected ways. And I'm curious for each of you, what the initial conversations were like that you had with Jane Campion about what kind of movie this was going to be, and how did each of you see it going in, and what the sort of potential challenges were, what things excited you about it. Maybe we'll start with you, Ari.
Yeah, so I started chatting with Jane about the film probably almost a year before we shot. So we had a lot of conversations, but our earliest conversations really focused around the book, which when she first called me, I had the script wasn't quite ready to read, but the book was obviously there. So I read that first. That was my in. And what she talked about was this way that the characters and the narrative kind of present themselves in a kind of together. You learn about the narrative and the characters through the narrative, and how that all those pieces kind of interweave a bit like the rope, in a way that these kind of pieces coming together, and a kind of should speak about this figure of eight, a kind of type of shape for the film. So yeah, for me, it was definitely the book and the kind of, I guess, the language or the structure of the book, and how that was also in the screenplay, and then yeah, how we could do justice to it, I guess. It's such a fantastic novel.
And Peter, what kinds of conversations did you have about the overall shape?
Yeah, I mean, early on when I first read the script and had a meeting with Jane, which was kind of like a job interview / meeting, the main thing, we talked about the world a lot, and you know, how it looked, because Ari and Jane had been working a lot together with Kirsty and Grant, I imagine, too, at the time, and had a lookbook. So we kind of just were talking a lot about the world that this was set in, and you know, this world of men and cowboys, and then the main thing we talked about editorially was just tension, and how we could maintain that for the duration of the script. And so that was really the thing we talked about a lot. because there's all different types of tension in this film. It kind of comes from. Yeah.
And Grant, I know that you worked with Jane Campion on Angel at My Table. I can't remember if you've done anything with her since then. How did you come onto this, and what was it like coming back to collaborate with her again after so many years?
It was 30 years previously for me, so it was almost like a full Saturn return of the astrological sense. But no, I hadn't worked with her since, and of course, her reputation had sort of grown hugely over that time. I didn't need to be asked twice by her, but like Peter, I was still being cast for the role of production designer. She's very careful about the creative people she gets around her, and also the people that would be around me. So what sort of people am I going to sort of have in the art department? Also, there was the practicalities about finding the location. She had been out previous to my interview and had look at a few places, but hadn't decided in particular on a place. So I wanted to hear my views about that. And also, at the time, we weren't necessarily going to be building the house from the ground up. Were there places in New Zealand that had the possibilities of playing the role of the Burbank house, things like that. So, I think Peter and Ari summed up most of the rest of the conversation, but it was certainly not, Grant, you've got the job, let's go to it. It's a lot of, she's very, very story focused, obviously, and likewise wanted to hear my views about what I recognized in the script as these sort of key moments.
Well, going back to what you said about finding the location, I'm curious, first of all, how the decision was made to shoot in New Zealand when the story takes place in Montana. And second of all, once that decision was made, what factors went into the decision to build the house from scratch rather than trying to find a house and, modify it?
Yeah, indeed. I am not really the right person to ask about choosing to shoot in New Zealand. I'm pleased she did. But, from what she has told me, they did visit, Tanya Sagetian and Jane did visit Montana and investigated it as options. She did mention to me that, maybe the Montana landscape she was looking for had sort of moved on somewhat since the 1920s, and that, New Zealand does offer these sort of untouched landscapes in a way, these big wilderness areas that do have a lot of character to them. And so, of course, there's pressure on us to find somewhere that did have an overall sort of feeling of what Montana could be. And I think we were very lucky to have found the Home Hills Ranch that we ended up using. Really as a gift to be able to have to build this. There was nothing in New Zealand that really was of the scale and of this sort of individuality, and the ability to be able to build this was a big challenge, of course, because there's a limited amount of money to make the film, but that we could start planning it exactly the way that the Burbank family needed to have been, that it had the right sort of genealogy, if you know what I mean, and that we could plonk it on a landscape in a very stark way that we ended up doing was really a gift from the gods, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, you bringing up all the planning leads me to a question for Ari, because I read, Ari, that you basically were on this movie, and you sort of mentioned this at the beginning, for a solid year before you started shooting. So what was going on during that year? What kind of work were you and Jane doing, and what was involved in that year of planning?
Yeah, kind of as Grant mentioned, a lot of it did focus around the ranch and the planning of it. And one of the big advantages of building is you can really design a space that works for the narrative, and that there's a lot of scenes that really required very particular relationships between spaces and eye lines, being able to see the corral from the kitchen, or for Phil to look down on Rose in the alley, all these very particular kind of story points that really did require a certain layout and a scale. And so we started talking about that very early, and imagining shots, and something that is also great when you have a year, you can kind of imagine an angle and then start to talk to Grant about, we want to look down on Rose at the piano from Phil's point of view. She can't really see him, but then we want to see like a hawk looking down on a rabbit kind of thing. And then really shape the architecture to facilitate the perfect shot and build out from there. And so yeah, a lot about the ranch. Then obviously color, and the color palette was a huge thing. It's really important to her that it was there was a visual unity, but also a minimalism and an elegance to it. So kind of choosing this quite restricted kind of dusty color palette that we settled on. We did all our shot listing in about 4 or 5 weeks. We went down to the location and stayed nearby. We would spend the mornings drawing and talking about some shot ideas. And then this was meanwhile while the house was being built, almost in getting finished. So in the afternoon, when the builders and Grant's team had left, Jane and I would arrive and start to see if those shots were going to work, and get inspired by, like, oh, the barn's been half erected, and we could start to see like, oh, this is an amazing silhouettes. And we'd planned it very specifically for the location. For the view from the barn is obviously really key plot point. Shooting a film it can be quite an intense experience, and I think for Jane it was really important to have a DP who was a real ally, and that we were really a tight team by the time we shot, so that after spending a year with someone, driving all over New Zealand and doing deep research and dinners and walks and picnics, and as Jane tends to do, swimming, you really a really tight friendship, really, to go into what really was a pretty intensive 10 weeks with a big break for coronavirus shutdown in the middle.
Well, since you brought that up, the coronavirus break, I wanted to ask you, Peter, about how that break affected the movie, because as I understand it, basically, movie shut down because of coronavirus, and then, you were able to edit during that time. So what kinds of things did you and Jane learn in that period that maybe then informed what the movie became once it resumed shooting?
During that break, we didn't actually do a lot of cutting together, but what I did do was I had an assemble of everything that was had been shot. So we had heaps of most of the exteriors in the barn, but nothing inside the house really. So it was a weird assemble, but I put it together for Jane and just put scene cards in for everything that was missing, which was where we were going to start. And when we did put it all together, and I played it for Jane, and I think you might have seen it too, Ari. Yeah. We kind of realized, okay, we can't actually start cutting the movie yet because we don't have a start, and every 3 scenes we miss one. And but what it did do was start a lot of conversations that really I think altered the second part of the shoot in a kind of great way. All the tactile stuff with Phil, this real close-up macro world stuff, and getting into his head, and also just the kind of more expressive camera work was really feeling kind of great. So I think a lot more of that was in the second shoot.
Yeah, Jane and I were talking a little bit over the break as well. It was such a strange time, but after a few weeks of calm, we started talking about, she showed me the cut that you'd done, Pete, and that she'd watched, and what was feeling really alive was some of the handheld work with Phil that initially we'd planned to only do in the sacred place, in his kind of private river, little willow glade. But after watching the footage from there, we really felt, Jane really felt like it kind of unlocked something between the relationship between the viewer and Phil, because it's really a film where we're watching a character who, I guess, has a public face and then also a kind of private life and interior mind. And there was something about watching him with a handheld camera that kind of unlocked some kind of, I don't know, I think access for the viewer. You feel feels very alive and present, and a vulnerability that was really exciting. So we ended up shooting a lot more of the interior scenes with Phil handheld that we hadn't initially planned to, but by watching that cut, that's something we definitely learned. And I don't think a lot of directors would never watch a weird kind of assembly with some of the biggest scenes thing, but really testament to Jane for kind of having the courage to watch that, burst the bubble of romance that you need in a film shoot. And I'm really glad she did, because that's some of my favorite scenes, really, the handheld work with Phil in the house. It's really vulnerable and exciting, I think.
Yeah, there's also some pickups for scenes that had already been shot to kind of add to them and get more into that world. The final shots, which I think is great, Pete with the rope, was all kind of, it's kind of towards the end, so I don't want to ruin the story and what its significance. But yeah, there was a whole different. It wasn't a drastically different end, but there was a really different note to end on, which I think was kind of an amazing discovery and brainwave from Jane before the second shoot. So yeah, a lot came from having some time. Me and Jane really talked a lot about Peter's character, and because he's kind of this very hard to read character, that it was really important that we, just story-wise, that we knew how close he was with his mother, Kirsten Dunst's character Rose, and so that those early scenes hadn't been shot yet. So there was a lot more. The approach to those scenes was quite different than it would have been, I think, had we not had a break.
Well, I want to take a look at a clip from the movie. This is actually a scene that Ari touched on, and I think it kind of it's a good platform to talk about some of the other things that have been brought up here. This is a clip from the movie with Kirsten Dunst playing the piano while Phil kind of torments her. So let's take a look at this clip, and then I'm going to ask each of you a little bit about it. So one of the things I love about that scene, I think it really speaks kind of to what you were saying, Ari, about the movie having this kind of minimalist elegance, because it's so simple, but it also just says so much about the dynamic between these two characters and sets up so much later. And Grant, I guess I'm curious from you in terms of the design of the house and what you were saying about, having the house be kind of expressive of the characters in this family and their inner tensions and things. Can you talk a little bit about how the house was set up to facilitate what goes on in that scene?
Yes, Ari touched on it a moment ago about the importance of these sight lines between the bedroom and where Rose is playing the piano. I mean, actually the design of the architecture hinged around that one sort of sight line in many ways. That how we laid out the rooms. So everything was pre-planned in that way, and obviously the house, it's a very big house, it's a very big boned house, and it's, in a way, the house is partially emptied out of furniture, as the parents have left to go into retirement 20 years before our story takes place. The house sort of reflects the sort of situation that we find at the beginning of our story. So the great way, the sort of production design, being able to sort of hint at this sort of prehistory, if you like, that we arrive at the start of the story. So, it's also able to reflect the sort of inner darkness in some ways of the characters that inhabit the place. The house is very much under Phil's thumb. I think he's a dominant masculine force that sort of has an overarching kind of presence everywhere in that house. And so, choosing these sort of dark surfaces and things to have these sort of very moody sort of scenes, and also the beautiful soundscape that was created with the echoey floors and those footsteps on the corridors give us sort of you keep reminding you of that inescapable presence of Phil. So we really tried to enhance those sort of situational kind of things. Even when later in the film, when Rose arrives, she really can't make much of an impression on this interior. She's arrives with I would imagine all sorts of optimism about being able to spread her wings in a place like this, but it gets stifled. So we see her in Phil's environment. She can't really escape Phil's environment except for a room that we've never really seen before in the earlier part of the film, in the parents' bedroom, which has really been locked away during the absence of the parents. And even when Rose goes into that room, it's a little bit of an unsettling room as well. We chose quite a sort of a jazzy wallpaper in some ways. It's not a very settled place, and the very dominant sort of furniture that's in the room makes it, still this kind of heavy sort of atmosphere in there. So, it's sort of a trap, I think, in the room and in the house and in that wilderness, even though it's so large, that Rose really can't escape from. So, I loved being able to flesh all those things out in the physicality of the set. Mm.
And Ari, what can you tell me about that scene, both in terms of the lighting and just in terms of your camera positions and how you shot the two of them to kind of convey the power dynamic that's going on?
There's not a lot of camera movement actually in the film. We wanted a kind of very patient camera, I guess, that would sit back and observe and be non-judgmental, not push a point of view too strongly. This is one of the few scenes where we kind of the camera moves in towards Rose. So it's very impactful when in the context of the film, when there's not much movement, when the camera finally does move, it really kind of gets you. And I love as well how the scene kind of has these visual rules, but they're also in many ways broken. Like the camera starts pushing in sync with her playing. And then at the end, when she realizes she's kind of been very much beaten, it has this kind of, realization or defeat kind of push in that suddenly you kind of really get inside her mind. And then the shots on Phil, there's a great power dynamic, I think, because the shot down on her is his POV, but she can't actually see him. So the shots of that Phil are from within the room, and they kind of, I think of them as like a mental POV. They're what she kind of imagines him as, that is really him that we're seeing, but it's also this kind of this extreme angle up on him, this domineering kind of, like I said, hawk, and that handheld kind of camera on him. You really feel his kind of tension and power and his superiority over her. Even that shot that we see her in has a very tiny kind of move that feels quite, there's something about it, going over a cliff kind of thing. So yeah, and then you can see there Grant's beautiful design with those beautiful dark surfaces, but then these big windows as well, which we wanted to really contrast the intensity and brightness of the exterior and then the darkness of the interior. So that was a big thing for us to, and then to be able to link the landscape into the house as well, which is a big technical challenge, because obviously we didn't build the interiors on location. They were in the studio. So that was really important to Jane and I to have a link with the landscape to the inside. And like Grant was saying, that what I love about the house is it's really like Jane describes it as a boat on the ocean. It's kind of, it should be a refuge, but it's actually not. There's nowhere to go. And I love as well the shot after this scene. You see Rose walking away from the house up the hill, and she's trying to get this sense of someone trying to escape, but there's nowhere really she can go. It's all plains and mountains for miles around. So I can see all our work kind of coming together in this one scene.
And Peter, tell me a little bit about the evolution of editing, not only this scene, but just approaching a movie where so many of the characters in this movie can't express themselves verbally. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about this movie. And what's it like editing a film where you have to convey what is going on inside of all these people who are not talking about it?
It's a really tricky thing, but we had such fantastic actors who can just kind of, you really become incredibly attuned to the smallest look, or a little eyebrow raise, or a fidget, or a moment, and then using that, it's all about kind of, do you hang a beat too long after a sentence to kind of give it a bit more meaning, or a kind of, is it something you don't believe because we're kind of hanging on a character? So it's all this very subtle kind of work in dialogue scenes, mainly, of just kind of letting the audience into what's happening without using any dialogue. Well, usually what's happening is the opposite of what someone's saying, so which is helpful, because you kind of you can illustrate that just with timings and great performance, obviously.
And how delicate is a scene like that one with her at the piano? Because on the one hand, it seems very simple, but I can also see just the smallest adjustments changing it pretty drastically.
Yeah, it's incredibly delicate. A scene like that is all about timing, all about pace. It's also, kind of need to work really closely with the sound department as well, because it's like every little kind of creak and the timing of the banjo was all adjusted in the edit. So it wasn't like it was just played. It was like, how long should it be? We had a really good bass, and then it was just adjusting slightly. How much do we hear early on? So there's so many other choices as well as just timings to make. Like, how much do you hear of the banjo the first time? How many times do we hear the banjo back and forth? Like, how long can we sustain this this moment, this back and forth? Because I'm pretty sure there was one more time we could have gone upstairs for a little bit more banjo before the big finale. So yeah, and then also just how much of Phil to show. We could have seen Phil in the room and approaching from the beginning, because we had that material. So it was kind of, there were really big choices to make on Rose's point of view, and I think the shot where it just pushes it on Rose felt like such a strong backbone for the scene, that we could really lean on that as our kind of structurally, and just bring Phil in one really kind of, in more of a horror sense, just like this kind of monster up in the room, and then use the sound of his boots, which kind of become quite a big thing in the house. I feel like this is a scene where it's kind of every department really comes together to kind of make what's, I think, a really special scene.
Yeah. Well, to wrap things up, I guess I'd like to ask each of you, for people who haven't seen the movie yet, what's one thing that comes to you just off the top of your head that is a reason why you would say they should watch it, something that would get them excited to watch it, or an aspect of the movie that you like, that you think they should be looking for? Start with you, Grant.
Like, to me, I'm fascinated by this terrific time period that this takes place in. On the one hand, it's a cowboy film, and you think of the sort of Wild West, but at the same time, it's kind of late Wild West, and a lot of the wild and the sort of pioneering sort of part of the West has been conquered now, and so we've got cars and we've got telephones and power and things like that. And I think it's a really nice kind of little glimpse into a terrific piece of American history that, as a backdrop for this powerful piece of drama. So as a production designer, that's what I particularly like about it.
Ari?
Yeah, it's a tough question, but I guess we've all been with the film for so long, so sometimes you think, is there anything more to discover? But I rewatched it again recently, and I think I was struck by this, the commonality between all of the characters in many ways, in that it's kind of a film about how individuals kind of react when they find themselves in a place that doesn't want them there, that they know that they're not welcome, or that there's something, even Phil, who fits in so well to that world, in many ways knows that he doesn't completely, as you kind of come to discover in the film. And Peter feels very unwelcome. Rose feels, from very, very obviously kind of pushed aside and ostracized and gaslit to kind of feel to the point that it drives her kind of almost quite crazy. And even George in many ways, you know, tries to be a kind of bit of a socialite, and it doesn't quite fit. But yeah, it's just kind of how individuals kind of what's their coping mechanisms. Everyone as well has a kind of self-soothing kind of escape, and whether that be reminiscing about the past or kind of nervous tics and what they throw themselves into to cope. So yeah, that was kind of a discovery I had recently. And again, I think it speaks to Jane's kind of fascination with humans, and just how this kind of empathy as well, that the film's very non-judgmental in the way that we watch these people. We don't really think of anything, that we understand why they're acting the way they do, and it doesn't feel like anyone's really doing. We understand when someone does something so-called bad, which is a really fascinating thing to watch. I think it's really engaging. It's quite multi-layered, I guess. No black and white, just full gray.
And Peter?
Yeah, for me, I'd probably go towards just like the unexpected nature of this this story, and just for an audience, I wish I kind of could have the experience of an audience not knowing every single like twist and turn in the film, but just how I feel like there's a great ambiguity in this film, and you think you're going in one direction and all of a sudden you start heading in a different one, and it's I think it'd be a real pleasure for an audience to enjoy that journey. So yeah, that's the thing I kind of think about when thinking about someone watching it for the first time. I think there's also, we talked a lot about, you know, a second viewing. So, you know, if you're enjoying the first, I think there's a lot to gain on a second viewing of this film. Yeah.
Definitely, I definitely agree. Well, I want to thank you all, Ari, Peter, and Grant, for coming and talking with us today. And thank you to our friends at Netflix, and to everyone watching. Thank you for joining us today for Half Hour With.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks for your time. Cheers.